Have you ever noticed how quickly things change when you stop responding right away? You don't send a long message. You don't explain. You just take a step back. And suddenly, people start acting differently. They check in more often. They ask questions that sound caring, but feel like surveillance. They start making comments, sharp, casual, indirect, just enough to poke at your silence. It doesn't take much. A delay in your reply. A canceled plan. The quiet, "I'm not available today." The reaction is immediate and revealing. Most people aren't used to you holding your energy. They're used to reaching for it and finding it there, like a light switch they never thanked you for. But the first time that switch doesn't flip the way they expect, something breaks. Not in you, in them. Because your predictability was never neutral. It was structure. It was access. It was control disguised as normal. Now step back and watch what happens. Some will call you distant. Some will test your boundaries in subtle ways. Some will pretend they don't notice at all, but start behaving strangely, like you violated some unspoken agreement. This is the moment people reveal how much of your presence they depended on without ever acknowledging it. Carl Jung once observed that what people project onto others often says more about what they refuse to face in themselves. And that's exactly what your absence does. It leaves them alone with the parts they were using you to avoid. You didn't change. You didn't disappear. You just stopped leaking. That's what it is, emotional leakage. Every quick reply, every forced smile, every time you stayed in the room longer than you wanted to. It trained people to expect your energy on demand. You didn't mean to do it. You were raised on approval. You learned that being available made you safe. That responsiveness earned you peace. But now, that wiring is fraying. You pause before replying. You let the message sit. You close the door. You say no without decoration. And that small shift, that quiet resistance, triggers something deeper than annoyance. It touches entitlement. It touches the assumption that your energy was never really yours. It was shared property, and your refusal to keep sharing it feels, to them, like theft. But it isn't theft. It's return. You're returning to yourself, piece by piece, moment by moment. Not in a dramatic rupture, in quiet defiance. And when you do that, the system shakes. Because the people who relied on your exhaustion won't know how to function in your clarity. That's what we're exploring in this video. What happens when you step back, not in anger, but in awareness. And why that simple decision unsettles the world more than any explosion ever could. Society's trap. It didn't start last month or last year. The reason you struggle to pull back now isn't random. It's the result of a very slow, very quiet kind of training. Most people were taught to be emotionally available before they even learned what emotions were. You were rewarded for being agreeable, punished for saying no, labeled difficult when you hesitated, dramatic when you reacted, selfish when you withdrew. As a child, you probably learned that compliance was safer than truth. That if you smiled, stayed quiet, and went along, the room stayed calm. And so you adapted. That adaptation becomes a pattern. You start to answer questions you don't want to. Stay in rooms that drain you. Apologize for needing time, space, or silence. And it works for a while. The people call you kind. They say you're helpful. You become the one everyone turns to when they're lost, when they're angry, when they're breaking. You're the sponge, the filter, the emotional translator for everyone else's mess. But here's the cost. You never learn to ask yourself what you need, because you were too busy managing what everyone else expected. This is how emotional overavailability becomes your default, not as a choice, but as survival. It becomes so automatic that you don't even notice how deep it runs. You reply to texts you resent. You show up for events that leave you empty. You stay in conversations where your silence would have said more. You think you're being good, but really, you've been trained like a social reflex. And the world applauds it. Because a person who can't say no is easier to keep close. It's built into how we raise children, how we structure schools, how we reward compliance in the workplace. Sit still, smile, be available. Eventually, you start confusing exhaustion with connection. You think being emotionally drained means you've done your part. You assume discomfort is just the price of being wanted. But is it? There's an old story about a monk who lived in a remote mountain temple. Villagers would climb the cliffs to visit him, seeking wisdom. At first, he welcomed them with tea and time. But over the years, the visits grew constant. Demands replaced gratitude. He found himself offering answers before people had asked meaningful questions. One day, he stopped opening the door. He sat in silence. And for the first time, people were forced to carry their own questions back down the mountain. That's where real clarity begins, in the space where your automatic yes becomes a deliberate pause. So ask yourself, when did you learn that being needed was the same as being loved? Who taught you that constant presence was the only way to be valued? Because if you don't know when it began, you won't recognize that it's still happening. And until you interrupt the pattern, you'll keep calling exhaustion empathy. Jung and psychic energy. Carl Jung didn't think of the mind as a machine. He saw it as an energy system, like a closed circuit, constantly balancing what it gives and what it holds. And here's the unsettling part. Most people have no idea how their energy is being spent. They think burnout comes from doing too much. But more often, it comes from doing too much of what drains you and too little of what grounds you. Every time you respond out of guilt, every time you over-explain, every time you jump to smooth someone else's discomfort, something leaves you, and it doesn't come back. Psychic energy is subtle. It doesn't announce itself like hunger or pain, but you feel it in other ways. You can't focus. You feel irritable for no reason. You spend hours replaying a 5-minute conversation, trying to fix it in your head. You get quiet, not from peace, but depletion. It's easy to dismiss this as stress, or tiredness, or just part of being sensitive. But underneath, it's something else. It's the cost of leaking your inner life into places that can't hold it. Think about how often you react to things that don't require a reaction. The passive-aggressive comment. A text that pushes a familiar button. A subtle shift in someone's tone. Your body braces. Your heart beats faster. You prepare to defend, explain, restore balance. But what are you actually protecting? Most of the time, you're trying to maintain a version of yourself that you didn't choose, one that exists to be palatable, agreeable, safe. And every time you perform that role, it drains you. Jung warned that unconscious reaction is one of the fastest ways to lose energy, because what you resist, you reinforce. What you fight blindly, you feed. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing wood at it, but doing it because you've always done it, without realizing there are other ways to live. You don't need to fix every misunderstanding. You don't need to rescue every conversation. You don't need to respond just because someone expects you to. But the urge to do it is strong. Not because you want to, but because you haven't questioned the reflex. And wary people can sense that. Especially those who've grown comfortable pulling from your reserves. They don't need to manipulate you directly. They just need to push the button. The rest happens on its own. This is how chronic exhaustion becomes the baseline for so many emotionally intelligent people. They mistake awareness for responsibility. They confuse sensitivity with obligation. But there is a difference between caring and collapsing. And until you see that difference clearly, you will continue to burn through your life force like it's infinite. It's not. And the ones who benefit from your unconscious reaction will never be the ones to tell you that it's time to stop. That part is yours to recognize and yours to reclaim. Projection and manipulation. There's something unnerving that happens when you begin to pull back. People start to behave like they've been betrayed, even if you haven't said a word. You don't lash out. You don't explain. You just stop playing the part they've quietly handed you. That's enough. Because what they're responding to isn't your silence. It's the collapse of a structure that kept their emotional world in place. Carl Jung called it projection, the process by which people unconsciously place parts of themselves onto others. Their fears, their expectations, their unresolved needs. You become a screen. They write on you without asking. They interact with the version of you they've constructed, not the one you actually are. It's why someone who barely knows you can claim you've changed. It's why a friend can feel betrayed when you create space. It's why a partner might grow angry when you become quiet. Not cruel, just quiet. Because in that quiet, the illusion breaks. You weren't supposed to evolve. You were supposed to continue playing the role, the fixer, the listener, the safe container for all the things they didn't want to deal with. And to be clear, it's not always malicious. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. But that doesn't make it harmless. The longer you stay in that role, the more invisible you become. Because it's not you they're engaging with, it's their idea of you. The version who always says, it's okay. The one who absorbs the tension. The one who understands without needing to be understood. And over time, that idea becomes the cage. You begin to feel like you can't change without disappointing someone. That your evolution is a threat. But that your boundaries are violations. So you stay soft. You stay accessible. You stay tired. Until something cracks. Maybe it's a late-night conversation that leaves you hollow. Maybe it's a long silence after giving too much. Or maybe it's the quiet realization that no one's really asking how you're doing. They're just making sure you're still doing what they need. And that's when it clicks. You've been performing a version of yourself that's digestible to others, but unlivable to you. It's a kind of psychological contortion, bending, softening, erasing, just to maintain relationships that rely on your distortion. When you begin to pull back, you're not withdrawing from people. You're stepping away from a narrative that was never written by your hand. And those who depended on that narrative will feel it. They may call you distant. They may accuse you of changing. They may try to guilt you into re-entering the story. But none of that means you're doing something wrong. It just means You've stopped participating in something that only worked when you abandoned yourself. Silence as a weapon. Silence has a reputation it doesn't deserve. In everyday life, people treat silence like a void, an absence, a failure to respond. But that's a misunderstanding built on habit, not truth. Because silence, when chosen consciously, is not the absence of power. It's its concentration. There's a moment, a subtle shift, when you stop answering every message the moment it arrives. When you stop defending your point. When you resist the urge to fill uncomfortable spaces with soothing words. And in that pause, you feel it. Your energy, once diffused across countless moments of over-explaining, reassuring, correcting, begins to gather, and it becomes heavy. That's what unnerves people. When you spoke to constantly, they could predict you. They knew how to read you. They could steer the conversation, guide the reaction, keep the temperature controlled. But when you fall silent, you become unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity feels dangerous. Not because you've become cruel, but because you've become unreadable. People mistake constant speech for connection. They assume that if you're talking, everything's fine. They rely on your words to navigate their discomfort. And when those words stop coming, they lose their compass. It doesn't take yelling. It doesn't take slamming doors. It takes quiet. Not passivity. Presence without performance. Carl Jung spoke often of the need to contain energy within the self. He didn't mean repression. He meant restraint. The discipline of choosing when to act and when to observe. Silence is a container. It gives you time to see what's real. You begin to notice which conversations exist, only to keep dysfunction alive. Which people only feel close to you when you're exhausted. Which dynamics rely on your instant reaction, just to maintain equilibrium. In silence, truth becomes visible. You realize how often you've spoken just to make someone else comfortable. How often you've explained something you didn't believe in. How many apologies you've given out of habit, not conviction. And the more you withhold from unnecessary reaction, the more the system begins to crack. Those who relied on your compliance will notice first. They may act confused. They may ask if something's wrong. They may try to re-engage you through guilt or humor or subtle provocation. But their real message is this: I don't know who you are if you're not reacting. And they're right. Because who you're becoming isn't reactive. It's reflective. And that version of you doesn't need to explain itself just to be valid. So let the silence do its work. You don't owe everyone an immediate answer. You don't have to keep performing stability for people who resist their own. Silence, chosen deliberately, is not the absence of connection. It's the return of self-possession. Conscious unavailability. There comes a point in your life when you stop running to every call, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because you finally understand what your energy is worth. You begin to realize how much of your day is spent reacting to messages, to moods, to suggestions disguised as expectations. You notice how often your plans dissolve to accommodate someone else's emergency. How often your silence is interrupted by the need to explain. And slowly, you begin to choose differently. You pause before replying. You let the phone ring. You say, I'll think about it, and mean it. To the outside world, this shift looks small. But inside, it's tectonic. Because for years, maybe decades, your identity was tied to being accessible, emotionally open, ready to help, ready to absorb, and always praised. People called you reliable. They said you had a good heart. They applauded your emotional labor, right up until you needed it back. But here's the truth, most won't say aloud. The more available you are, the less people think before asking. The more you say yes, the less they hear it as a gift. The easier you are to reach, the easier you are to take for granted. So you start pulling back. And the moment you do, the discomfort begins. Not just theirs, yours. Because unavailability doesn't come naturally to someone who is taught that love is earned through sacrifice. The guilt will creep in. You'll wonder if you're being cold. You'll feel the urge to explain, to soften, to offer disclaimers for your distance. But there's a deeper process unfolding. You're not withdrawing from people. You're withdrawing from the version of yourself who was always expected to say yes. That's the correction. That's the act of reclaiming something that was always yours. Choice. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, required separation. Not forever. Just long enough to remember who you are when you're not being mirrored by everyone else's demands. So you begin to practice what feels unnatural. You don't answer immediately. You don't justify your no. You don't absorb someone else's panic like it's your responsibility to fix. And the people who depended on your availability will react. Some will adjust. Some will push harder. Some will leave. Let them. Because what's unfolding isn't cruelty. It's clarity. When you become unavailable by choice, the right people don't see it as rejection. They see it as alignment. They understand that your time has weight, that your silence has meaning, that your boundaries aren't walls. They're windows into who you've finally become. And once you've tasted that kind of internal steadiness, you stop negotiating it for temporary comfort. You stop making yourself smaller to stay close to people who only loved you when you were always saying yes. Solitude and rebirth. There's a moment after the noise settles. Niti, after the calls stop. After the messages slow down and the calendar clears. It's quiet. And that silence is uncomfortable at first. You feel the phantom pull of all the places you once poured your time, your attention, your availability. It feels strange to wake up and not owe someone an explanation. It feels unfamiliar to sit in stillness without scanning for who might need you next. But then something else begins to emerge, slowly, like memory rising through fog. Clarity. You start to hear yourself again. Not the rehearsed version. Not the one filtered through politeness or performance. The real voice. The one that got buried under obligations, and obligations disguised as love. Carl Jung understood this return. He believed that the process of becoming whole, truly whole, could not happen in constant proximity to others. You had to separate, retreat, confront. You had to learn who you were without feedback. And that part, it's brutal. Because when you step back, you don't just lose contact, you lose identity. The version of you who existed for others starts to dissolve. And with it, the illusion of being liked because you were endlessly available. People will fall away. Some will disappear quietly, unsure how to relate to the new rhythm of you. Others will challenge your change, call it selfish, dramatic, unnecessary. But look closer. What they're really saying is, I don't know how to engage with you now that you have limits. And that's okay. Because in the absence of noise, you don't just find yourself, you rebuild yourself. You relearn what peace feels like. You remember what it means to do things on your time, in your way, without external permission. You become unfamiliar, even to yourself. But in that unfamiliarity, something sacred forms. You start choosing people who don't require your exhaustion as proof of your care. You stop apologizing for taking up space without giving something in return. You speak less, but when you do, it comes from somewhere real. You realize that your presence, when no longer diluted by obligation, becomes felt even in your silence. And that's the irony. When you stop trying to be everywhere, when you stop explaining, when you stop chasing connection, you become unforgettable, not for what you give away, but for what you no longer surrender, just to stay connected. So here's the question. Are you willing to be misunderstood if it means being at peace? Are you willing to lose the version of yourself people preferred in order to become the version you actually are? If so, write it in the comments. I choose clarity over compliance. And if this message stayed with you, stay with us. There's more ahead. Subscribe to Restless Wonder and walk with those who are ready to be whole, even if it means being alone for a while.